Okay, here we are. So the first topic we're going to talk about is who do you write to please? And I'm not sure I know my answer to that question. Does someone have an answer? Someone want to start off?
I can start. I write to please myself. I write the sort of story I would like to read, or I try to anyway. Um, I don't always succeed at that, but I'm always thinking of what do I want to read because I don't know how to write for anybody else because I don't know what they would like. So I always just try to go for myself, and that's probably kind of a dull answer, but that's how I do it.
Yeah, I'm the same. I sort of have sort of vision of a reader out there, but I suspect that reader is just a form of me, and you know that's kind of how I operate too.
I think in my first series, apart from the autobiographies, was that I was writing about what I know, and I made that fictional and expanded on that. And then when I got, it sort of dawned on me that and I enjoyed doing that, and it was writing for me and thinking up exciting stuff. But then it dawned on me that Africa wasn't the flavor of the month anymore. It sort of moved over to India for some strange reason, and everybody was going India and everything. And so then I started on the psychological thrillers because they seem to be selling better, and they probably have. But yes, I wouldn't write something that I wouldn't want to read. I agree with both of you there.
Mhm.
Well, for decades, I just wrote mostly for myself to get stuff out, and just play with concepts. And then occasionally would hand those off to friends or coworkers, whatever, see what they thought. And I did that for many decades. But even now, um, with the books I publish, it's exactly what Bertolt said, which I forget who was the original quote, to say, write what you would like to read. And that really is what drives me the most when I'm thinking about a new concept or something I want to experiment with. It's always something I'm going to enjoy first myself. And then, of course, I hope other people like it too. I mean, that's also the point of telling stories is you have an audience that you hope will enjoy it. But
What about input from beta readers or a critique group? Has anyone ever sort of changed something, a piece of their writing, in a way that didn't feel right because others strongly weighed in and said, you have to do this?
No,
I
I'm sorry, just
I was
no.
with you until you said didn't feel right.
Yeah.
Because there were times where I had a beta reader, point something out, and I hated to get rid of an entire section or something, but somewhere inside I agreed with it. It was when I saw from their point of view how the story was going, I thought, you know what, they're right. This is a distraction. This isn't necessary. Cut it out. But there are times like I for my first book, I did have someone who graciously she gave her time to do sort of a high level editor's point of view, and there was one thing she wanted to get rid of, and then she said when she took this on, she said, I don't never do comedy or humor. I've usually done biographical work, etc., historical stuff. So I said that's okay, and then she wanted to get rid of something. I thought no, because that's a recurring joke. And if you look at it unto itself, yeah, why is this here? But then if you know how humor is constructed, there will be a payoff. And so I kept that in. But because I knew what I wanted there and I knew the rules I was going for. But overall, I have to still feel if I'm going to agree, I got to feel like, yeah, I may not completely agree with your point of view, but you have a good point, and I'll go for it. I will cut or change or whatever. So I
Yeah,
had,
I went through a phase where I would tweak things because the critique group people had certain, opinions. And in the end, I had to decide where, like you say, where do you draw the line? You have to really think about it, and if you don't really want to make a change, but really does feel like the right thing to do, then you do it, as opposed to doing it just because somebody says that in their opinion you should do that.
Yeah,
And
right.
that's one of the
Yeah.
tricky things of working with other people on about your writing.
There
Yeah.
there are as many views about your story as there are readers of your story.
I
So,
remember
yeah.
reading one review, and the reviewer says, "Well, you can see that she's done this because it's a parallel to this, and it's a juxtaposition of the other." And she was really trying to tell this, get this message across. And I'm thinking, what? It was
That
just,
sounds
I
like
just
high
wrote.
school English class.
Yes, I thought, no, none of that is true. It's just I wrote the story because I thought it was fun, and etc., etc. So, but this person had just like you take things to shreds, in English lit classes. This person had done the same to one of my stories, and I thought, I don't know where she's getting all this from, but if that's what she wants to think, fine. But I didn't even think about that. I just wrote it as hopefully a story that somebody might like to read.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. Does anybody else have that experience where a reviewer has tried to give your story far more depth and meaning than you ever intended it to have? Or sees something like what Lucinda just mentioned, the juxtaposition of this. I don't remember how you said it, but it's interesting when reviewers give my stories more depth than I ever intended them to have. Because,
Well,
like you, Lucinda, I just write a story to write a story.
that sort of happened with Friendship of Mortals and some relatively recent reviews where clearly the people who had read it, I think they were a group. They were a group that reads a book and then they all review.
Book club.
And I think that was kind of nice in a way, but they gave it a very sort of contemporary reading and had all kinds of problems with the way I dealt with mental health and some other things. And I read sections of it over again and I thought, how did they come to this conclusion? Which is sort of interesting in a way because like I say, I think these were younger people, not old people like us, and they had a different view of certain things,
Yeah.
and that is really an eye opener.
I've had people review books, and yeah, there's one I can think of one review where somebody was looking at it from a perspective that I had never really considered. I mean, it made sense. It was like this is a legitimate way to look at the story. I had never thought of it like that before, and I was like, well, that's interesting. Um, it helped probably that they still liked it, so you know.
Yeah.
Well, I've had a couple of reviews where I read through and somebody said, I really enjoyed ABC, and I'm thinking to myself, C never happened in that book. But if they enjoyed it, I want to take that joy away. But you do have to realize, whenever when you talk about especially novel work, some of it is basically an ink blot, and people are always going to read from their experiences.
Yeah.
And what's more interesting, and I think where it really gels, and this is to Audrey's point, is when there's a group of people discussing your book, and that's when an idea gets kicked around and then gets really
Yeah.
sort of fully fleshed. And then it might be a revelation to you. You might even say, I never thought I was doing that, or it might just be so out there. And I think that's fascinating. I didn't want that, but sure. So.
Yeah, that was pretty well it. I think they had discussions among themselves on Twitter. Now, I wasn't party to those because I'm not on what used to be, well, now it's X. Anyway,
Twitter.
I wasn't
It's still Twitter. It's still Twitter.
discussions, but I had a feeling there was this undercurrent, and that was kind of interesting. It wasn't a I don't know. Some of the reviews I think were off the mark and kind of harsh, but it was certainly interesting to see how you put a piece of writing out there and you just never know what someone's going to think of it. So
Yeah.
that's part of the thrill of being an author, I guess. And we have to accept that with both good and bad.
You know the old saying that if you put your head above the parapet, you must expect the arrows to come flying.
Exactly.
I like that.
Well, it's interesting. You can even, I like what Richard said about it's an ink blot because you can sort of see that if you ever like read a book and then reread it many years later, sometimes your reaction will be very different because you've had different experiences. And so the same thing just hits very different. And you go, oh, and sometimes it's good. Sometimes you're like, I get it now. And other times you're like, what did I ever see in that book? Um,
I I read, have any of you read The Book Thief?
yeah.
Mm.
So I
Yeah.
read that maybe a dozen years ago, and maybe even more than that. Absolutely loved it. And then I lost my copy of the book. So I got a new copy within the last year and tried to read it, and I couldn't get 20 pages into it. I have no idea what happened between then and now, but it's like I can't stand this book. So
I've had the reverse books I didn't like and then
yeah,
read
yeah,
them and end up
yeah,
liking.
yeah. So my answer on this question of who do you write to please is I don't think I write to please anybody, including myself. I just write to see if I can write the story that I have an idea for. And that's it. So if I'm successful, does that please me? Yes, but I'm not necessarily, I don't know, I don't view it as I'm doing this for myself. I'm just doing it to see if I can.
But it isn't that in itself. Yeah.
Yeah,
I know
yeah, I
what you
don't know.
mean. The end result isn't as important as that process and getting idea to. Yeah, I get.
Yes,
I
yeah. But
Ideally,
certainly don't think of like the ideal reader of who out there who is it I'm trying to please by writing the story, a reader or no, I don't think about that at all.
So
And
it's
it
just getting it done that pleases you in
yeah,
the end, right?
yeah.
cathartic.
What did you say?
It's cathartic
Yeah, something. Yeah.
in some form, right? You know, you're either solving something or there's something, that you're tapping into that, it's good to get that out.
I mean,
Well, I think
ideally, sorry, ideally,
no,
I'd
go ahead.
like to be writing for my bank manager and the New York Times hit
Yeah.
list. But that hasn't happened, so I've just got to
Right,
please me.
right. I think it kind of ties into the one of the other questions I we have on our list, the do you know the end before you start? Um, I never know the end before I start, and I think that's what I write. That's why I come up with these ideas, put someone in a situation, and I don't know, have a clue how it's going to end when I start. So the process, the I don't know what the word is, but it's it's to see if I can do it, to see if I can get it to an end that is worthy of the story.
Mhm.
I
So
I usually do start with an end in mind, but there's no guarantee that's where I'm going to end up. Yeah, it's because
I like to say I always know what the end is going to be, but it's kind of hazy though.
right.
It's not detailed. I don't have a detailed outline. I just kind of know, okay, I want these characters to end up here, and how I'm going to accomplish that, I kind of work out as I go along.
I think it helps to be flexible because I do have a beginning and I do have an end in mind, but sometimes when the characters take over and a third way through, you think of this amazing twist that you hadn't thought of, last week or whatever. Um, and generally, you can just it yeah it can happen that the ending is what you expected, but it's also possible that the ending is something a bit different. And at the end of one book, I couldn't make up my mind who to sort of blame. And I left it a bit open ended, which caused a bit of furor. So then, having decided a month later who it was, I then had to put the beginning of the next book at the end of the first book, just so that people would know because they were all upset because I didn't tie up all the loose ends. as theory. But yeah, it can work both ways for me.
I'm just going to interject that I think the best stories, the loose ends, shouldn't be tied up. Not all of them. There should be
Yes.
something for people to think about afterwards.
Yes.
But that's me. I I usually have an ending of some sort in mind, although I'm writing something now where I basically very deliberately am I I've heard Mark say this before, and I was like, I want to write a story like that where I don't know how it's going to end. I'm going to just start with a situation and see where it goes. So I'm doing something like that now, and I'll be interested to see what happens. But usually I do have some notion of the end in mind.
Actually, I just thought my second book, Perseus Kills His Grandfather, that
Well,
was the ending. And it actually was one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book, because whenever I see some version of the Perseus myth, they leave, to me, the best part out, the whole reason for the myth, or that you can't escape fate. So yeah, in that case, I was bound to end on that note, or sort of like, why bother? Yeah.
I'm rereading that now, actually, Richard. It's
Oh,
really good.
oh, thank you.
Your opinion of it hasn't changed?
If anything, I'm liking it better this time. There's things I hadn't picked up on before that I noticed the second time.
Am I getting redder? Because
I
I don't deal with book praise very well physically.
So sometimes I think that figuring out the ending can limit the possibilities as you write. That because I'm thinking about a story that Bertold desperately wants me to finish writing, and I have no idea if I'm ever going to, but it's called The Jump. And my idea for it was I had this idea for an ending, and then the last time I sat down and tried to work on it and think about it, I came up with a not a different ending, but a, a whole additional complexity to the ending. And so I feel like part of the benefit of not really knowing the ending is it creates a lot of flexibility. It gives me a lot of chance to really come up with what the best ending would be based on what I've written.
Don't you find sometimes the characters just take over and do their own thing, and you're just dragged along for the ride because they've got their own characters? They know how they react to various things. I found this a couple of times, and I thought, I don't really want her to do this or that, but she insists. And as I say, you just sort of put down because it seemed to be right for her at that time.
I don't know if it's the characters that do that or just the story as I figure out how to tell the story. That's what moves me in different directions. And this additional complexity to the ending of the jump, if I ever finish it, is just kind of basically turns the whole story upside down at the end,
Oh, that's
from my
cool.
perspective. So, okay. Does the protagonist have to be sympathetic or perfect? Okay, you have to follow that evil chuckle up with your
Well, okay, there's a story that I know Audrey has read this. I don't know if anyone else has. You've probably seen me talk about it. It's called The Repairer of Reputations. Um, that's probably my favorite short story ever. The protagonist of that is so not perfect. And I can't really say much more without spoiling it, but it's brilliantly done, and the whole thing that makes it work is that he's not perfect, to say the least.
He's
So,
actually kind of a mess, I'd say.
oh, absolutely.
Yeah, unreliable. Yeah.
Yes. So no, I don't think they have to be likable or perfect at all.
I
Do
think
you think about, go ahead,
something
Audrey.
has to be likable, though. I mean, if all of the people in your novel or story are terrible, I find I don't want to keep reading. So they may not be in fact, I think they better not be perfect because nobody is, and you want your people to be relatable. But I think they have to be someone you want to spend time with. At least some of them have to be. Otherwise, it's like, you're in with a group of people and the only thing you want to do is get out of there. I think that's a bad situation. So I think they have to be in some way, even though they may be crooks or on the verge of some kind of breakdown or doing something that's not very good, but the character himself or herself has to be someone you don't mind having in your head for a while. Yeah.
And I must admit, I worked with somebody once who was pretty much perfect. She never had a bad day. She never had a hair out of place. She hadn't she didn't have any dog fur on her clothes. She was just so nice and so sweet and so well. I actually grew to dislike her intensely because she was just so perfect. And I think if you have a perfect character in a book, that certainly I would react to that. Think, no, come on, this is too much. I don't believe it. What's her guilty secret that we're not, I might find out on the last page. So no, I think not an anti-hero necessarily, but I do think you need a character with faults, because one of the main things about a story is that the main character has a problem to overcome, and having got over it, it's just changed them in some way. So if they're perfect to start with, unless you're going to sort of bang them up in prison at the end, where do you go from there? What do they learn from their experiences or from what happens to them?
Me?
Yeah, I remember in a critique group, somebody said one of my main character, Herbert West, Francis Dexter, that he was too perfect. In fact, I think what the guy he said, it reminded him of Doc Savage. Does anyone know Doc Savage? He's some cartoony type character from a long time ago.
Long time
He
ago.
do almost anything.
Character, right.
Yeah. But I think okay, your character may be competent and able to do a lot of stuff, but they have to have some sort of secret or something that's not right about them or something they're afraid of or something like that. And I think I did accomplish that, even though the character may have been a little too skillful at just ordinary life things.
Well, he's
So
skillful, but he's a sociopath. So I feel like that's a major flaw. But anyway.
To me, I think you can have a perfect character, but if you're going to write and bring in readers, perfection is boring. Right? Unless you're going to take that perfect character and surround them by the most imperfect characters, balance that way. And the same thing with a protagonist that's unlikable. I think Audrey accusing they're all unlikable. Although I could think of an exception, but if they're all unlikable, it's a why you're going to be. I don't want to read about these people. It's irritating. But if you surround the unlikable protagonist with likable characters, and that's been done a lot.
Or if you take the perfect character and break them down in
break
some
them
way.
down, or see that they can't deal with imperfection
Yeah.
at some point,
Yeah.
then all of that works. I was thinking though, not that I would write something like this, but you could write especially a horror story where the people are horrible, but then bad things happen to them. So you as the reader get to be like vengeance, and
Yeah.
get visceral. But I'm just saying that's part of balancing everything else. Why would you have all irritating or dislikable people? There must be a reason behind it for your story. Otherwise, you be aware you're going to be turning people away. So if you have something more compelling to keep them in there, the reason, the goal of your writing, then sure. So me, like I said, it's comedy. Inspector Clouseau is the most imperfect person, and that's where the comedy comes from. And often foibles and imperfections are at the root of that. So I almost have to have people, or at least the bulk of the people in my characters have to be imperfect in some way, and likable or not. They don't have to be likable. In fact, the Perseus book, somebody who just read it said that, and quote, something like, am I supposed to dislike a King of Croesus because he's making me crack up? And I thought, well, yeah, he's unlikable, but there's comedy around it. So
Well, I was going to say, Richard, since you have written a book where a major character was the devil, you're the one to ask about this. So.
you know what? Let me just say something about that devil and the wolf. But one of the things that I put in there that I don't think anyone ever gets is the heroes of the story are actually the only ones that end up killing people. Right? The Sodomites again I mean, they're not people they're killing, they're demons or whatever. But yeah, it's there's twist in the background of me playing with characterization. That's all. But yeah, thanks.
Now, Richard, that begs the question, are writers actually control freaks? Because we can do anything with our characters that we actually find. I mean, we could chop legs off or throw them under buses or, kick them off the Empire State Building or whatever. Because we could actually form them. And if they start off bad, we can make them good and vice versa. There's a lot we can, we're just sort of in charge, aren't we?
I think that's very good point, very true. But for me, the exception comes in dialogue. I start writing and I get in the zone, and then I'm writing dialogue that I wasn't expecting, and sometimes can affect the story. So although that's still me somewhere in there, but I think on the overall, when you're looking at what you're doing with your characters, again, at least if not consciously, subconsciously, yeah, you're controlling a world. You're creating an entire world. And you have control of all the elements, what people see, what they hear. The unreliable narrator is like classic for that, because you are even controlling the reader's point of view, manipulating it. So.
Yeah, I find that we're always told that we should make our characters suffer. Now, does anyone have a problem with that? Like if you've created this person and you kind of like them, they seem like a nice person, how do you make them suffer?
I have absolutely no problem with that.
Well, no, me.
Okay, so I don't have a problem with it in a certain type of story. It's fine. But I will say it again, this is based largely on things I see on Twitter. There are people who are like, well, if you're writing a story, you're going to make your character suffer. It's like part and parcel of writing a story is sometimes the vibe I get. And I don't see that necessarily has to be okay. So there has to be drama. So they have to have some sort of problem. But like, and you all know I'm going to say it. PG Wodehouse. I mean, his characters, do they suffer? Kind of, but it's from like the most trivial problems in the world. They're all well-to-do, aristocrats. So is that even suffering? Not really, but it still can be a good story, even though nothing much in the way of true suffering occurs. So I'm not against it. Like, it's not like no character should ever suffer, but I don't think it has to be that way.
And
you're still
too. I mean, you can't just throw in sort of good. It's sort of like that God from the Machine thing where some power comes and saves the day. You can't just throw in gratuitous suffering just because gotta check the suffering box.
So Mark says we do. Yes.
Why not? I was going to say, Bertold, I'm surprised you still read anything I write.
Well, again, like it makes. You write the type of stories where that makes sense and it's appropriate that suffering is going to happen. It's like, okay, fair enough. But
I just thought of the perfect character who wouldn't be perfect now, that he was a while ago, and that's Hercule Poirot. Because he would sort of solve something by saying, right, he must have left on the 6:20 train and he would have left from here. Then he would have arrived at Euston at such and such a time and all the rest of it. And you're thinking, you've got to be joking. They were probably on strike at the time, 50 years later. It's never going to arrive there. And you can tell that this was bolted to the floor because X, Y, Z. And you think, No, I can now, if you reread them, you think of a dozen different reasons why the bed was bolted to the floor, or, the window was left open, or whatever. So whereas at one time he would have been absolutely perfect and solved everything in, 20 or well, 100, couple of 100 pages, now he couldn't be more wrong, if he tried.
I was going to say, I think that's one of the aspects of this. Perfect characters, at least in my mind, perfect characters frequently are on genres like mysteries. The person solving the mystery always knows the answer, always figures, and the other example I was thinking about was Tom Clancy. Those types of books where the hero, again, is always right, never misses a shot, everything always goes perfectly for the hero while going through some challenges. And I realized I think that's probably one of the reasons why I don't read any of those types of books anymore. Because I don't need a perfect character. I don't need a perfect hero. And so I tend to read other books these days where they're not entirely sympathetic. They're definitely not perfect. And that's also, I don't know that I necessarily, when I'm writing, think about it intentionally, but I try to write stories about real people, and real people aren't perfect. They're going to have flaws, and sometimes they have more than in other stories that I write, but they're not entirely 100% likable either. They're not perfect or entirely likable. So,
Well, I used to be a great Jack Reacher fan, until I read one about a year ago, and it said he put his toothbrush in his pocket and he was ready to leave. And the first thing I thought was, well, where's his clean underwear? Where's his change of shirt? Where's his deodorant? And I just went off him right like that. And I've not read another story of his or watched a film since, because I thought, I don't believe this.
It could be smelly.
yeah.
Actually, I've noticed a trend recently. You had your perfect detective like Hercule Poirot, or come to that Sherlock Holmes, who are always on top of things and they figured out. Nowadays, a lot of the detectives are kind of a mess. They're always struggling with an addiction or alcoholism, or they've got some sort of bad thing that they did recently that they're trying to overcome. And that's almost being overdone now, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
Especially to establish like the remakes and everything. They're trying to add depth where there wasn't. I think, but I was going to say this earlier. I think that also though is the whole point of the mystery, the genre of mysteries, is they're a puzzle to be solved. And and whatever the main detective is, however that detective is, I think is almost incidental. It's the picture, part of the picture of a jigsaw puzzle, but the point of the jigsaw puzzle is to solve it by putting the pieces together to make the whole. And so, yeah, I maybe when I read mysteries, I tend to cut a lot of slack for that reason, because I know that's not the reason. What's really the point of the story is, can you solve this riddle, puzzle, etc. And of course, again, it's not 100% that you have to have good characters, etc. But I'm just saying that I tend to be a little more forgiving, just like with science fiction and fantasy. I tend to be very forgiving because as long as things are logical, I'm okay. But I'll say, sure, yeah, you can teleport atoms and people aren't dying when you're doing that or whatever. You can travel faster than light, whatever it is. I'll go, sure, I'll buy that because that's not really, that's not what you're doing here. That's just addressing around it.
You can have a space elevator too.
You could have
Yeah.
space
Right.
I, I I should warn we're running close to the time limit.
Okay.
Not 2 minutes.
Okay. Well, I think we're pretty much done with that topic. Not enough time to start another one.
Yeah.
Or is there anything else anybody would like to add?
I I do have one I maybe want to bring up next time. We've talked about writing process a lot, but I want to know for all of you, because I'm working on something new now, and something occurred to me that I didn't know I have done with every book I wrote, the other two books, but How, when you say, Mark, you talk about, you have a concept you want to do and you have a story you want to write. What point do you feel like, yeah, I mean, you do your research, et cetera, and then you start to put pen to paper. What point do you say this could work? And I'm going to go all in, because I didn't realize I did this with the first two books. I talked a lot about how I, did my writing style and everything, but it occurred to me, and I was talking to someone about the Percy's book, that I actually do sit and write a scene with the main character, and sometimes two scenes. And if I feel like that works, I'm then gonna go after I've done my research and everything. And I'm first starting to write, and the scene may not end up exact, but I know the scenes even. I realized Devil and the Wolf was a scene I wrote called, lunchtime is served, lunch is served. And Perseus, I wrote two. One was Stolen Horse, and the other was Training with Athena. And I had to convince myself. Now, I don't know, next time we could talk about this. What do you, as authors, do when you have a concept and maybe even done your research and everything, or most of it, and you start to write? When you get convinced I should put the time and effort into seeing this through?
All right.
Okay, then we'll talk more about that next time. Thank you. Good
Thank
to see
you.
everybody.
Everyone.